question, what you do when duties conflict. One, you operate with a hierarchy of duties, and you decide which one ranks higher. Now that's what I was implying when I said which is more essential in respect for persons. You see. The other is to introduce rules to govern exceptions to moral rules. Put that another way, you are qualifying the moral rule. So you mustn't lie is just a shorthand for a much longer moral rule with all sorts of qualifications, defining what you mean by a lie. You see. Just as some Old Testament scholars say about the commandment, thou shalt not kill, that read in that context, there are all sorts of qualifications that are built into it. You just have to look in the context to see them. You see. It's not a blanket rule. It's a qualified rule. So it's difficult to know exactly what Kant does, and you know that's how some Kant specialists earn their reputations, is arguing about how to interpret Kant that way. Esther?
As far as knowing what your sense of duty is that...
Knowing what your sense of duty is? No.
I mean, if you're acting out of a sense of duty...
Well, then you don't have to worry about knowing it. If you're acting out of a sense of duty, you must know you have a sense of duty.
But how do you determine what is your sense of duty?
No, you mean how do you determine what is your duty? By the categorical imperative. That is the way in which you know what is your duty. Would you be acting on a maxim that could be universalized? Would you be acting out of respect for persons? Would you be acting out of an autonomous will? It's the way you know. It's the way you decide. No, he doesn't give you a whole list of rules. Well, you don't want a rule book for ethics. You've got to make moral decisions in cases where there are no rules anyway. That's what medical ethics today and bioethics is about. You see? No, moral thinking is about how most basic moral principles affect our decisions. Or if we're trying to formulate moral rules we should follow, how do you formulate those moral rules? The answer is on the basis of the categorical imperative. Say that again.
Then how do we know what's right and wrong? Is it based on a...
Exactly. On the basis of the categorical imperative.
Well, in that diagram up there, we have the a priori principles.
This here, the a priori principle is the categorical imperative. Come at that one other way. Some of you have seen me talk this way before, but I find it helpful to distinguish between 4 levels of ethical discussion. A particular case, an area rule, a rule that applies to an area of moral responsibility, like a rule against lying. Overall principles, that is to say, principles that apply to every kind of area of responsibility, to the entire moral life. And then the basis on which those principles rest, which would be a theological basis or a philosophical basis of some sort, metaphysical basis. Okay? Now, in Kant's case, the principle is the categorical imperative. You see? The categorical imperative. He might have a rule about truth-telling, which is based on the categorical imperative. To lie is not respecting persons. I think I can fool you, deceive you, manipulate you by my lies. You see, it's not respecting persons. So the rule is based on that, and that's applied to the case. So how do you know what's the right thing to do in a particular case? Well, normally we check the rules. You know, you have certain moral rules of thumb. You have certain explicit biblical moral teachings. And there are certain societal moral standards, professional code of ethics, whatever it might be, you see. But when you're trying to formulate such rules, or try to handle conflicts between moral obligations at the rules level, you see, then you go back to what the overall principle demands. Okay. I think there is another feature that feeds into ethical discussion, and that's what I call background beliefs, BBs, background beliefs. You know, if you're dealing with questions in business ethics, then your underlying belief about the meaning and purpose of work, of economic activity, comes into play. If you're dealing with matters of medical ethics, then your belief about the purpose of medical care comes into play. And there's literature, for instance, that from a Christian point of view, about the attitude of the medical profession, that we have to extend human life at all costs to the patient. Not just economic costs, but costs of suffering, lingering. You see, arguing that from a Christian point of view, death is something to be accepted, not endlessly denied. You see. And that the preservation of life is not the highest end. You see. It's not an argument for active euthanasia, but it is an argument against extraordinary means of extending life when, by all natural standards, life is drawing to a close. So background beliefs.
Yeah. I have a question on the categories themselves. These a priori categories, are they as objective as the metaphysics?
Yeah, you see, I started today by talking of Kant as a moral realist.
Okay.
You see, the categorical imperative, don't call them categories, there's one categorical imperative, this is three ways of stating it. The categorical imperative is his way of distinguishing right from wrong. You see. Now, is he making up the distinction? No. This is his way of recognizing a distinction that's already there. You see. Moral right and moral wrong are two very different things. How do we know which is which? By means of the categorical imperative.
It seems strange to me that he'd be a moral realist while in metaphysics he believes in the phenomenal and humility.
Ah, but he told you he was going to be at the end of the first critique.
I haven't gotten that far.
Yeah, now read that last section in the first critique, you remember, where he talks about belief, moral belief as distinct from doctrinal belief. Now why? Well, at this juncture, all he's doing is talking about moral experience. Where does moral experience occur? Within the mind, wrestling with moral obligation in relationship to desires and inclinations. In other words, moral experience as such is not experience of a space-time world at all. You see? And so your forms and categories of science and metaphysics don't impose themselves on our moral thinking. You see. So it is in our moral life, in the inner life of the human spirit, that you have an open door into the nature of reality. That's why it is that idealism and romanticism is a result of Kant. You see, the turn is a turn away from the observing the external world of science to the inner world of the self. That was his Copernican revolution, wasn't it? Yeah. So that Copernican revolution has very far-reaching implications. Remember when we talked about the effects of Kant in 19th century idealism, romanticism, all the rest of it? Well, you begin to see it here in terms of ethics. Kant is hardly a romanticist, but he's often called an ethical idealist. That is to say, one who describes the ultimate reality in ethical terms, in terms of right and wrong. An ethical idealist. So Kant's God is a moral deity.
Isn't if everyone has the a priori principle, isn't it also very deterministic? Like more people are going to be like.
No. The fact that in examination, analysis of moral experience you uncover by the transcendental method, this categorical imperative, doesn't mean to say that everybody has to follow the principle. If there's freedom of will, you can turn your back on the principle. You see? And that's precisely what some people do. What was it in Milton's Paradise Lost that the devil said? Evil, be thou my good. See, that's the evil will. That's not goodwill, that's evil. Now, if he were not an indeterminist, you see, if he didn't emphasize freedom of will, you'd be right, it would be a determinism. But the principle is not a principle that determines your decisions. The principle is a principle which reason can observe in guiding the will. Yeah. Peter?
I don't see how we get from the subjectivity of ethicity to objectivity of moral experience and being able to
Yeah, well, hold the phone on that one, would you? Just a little bit. So far, the only part of the response that we can have is that this kind of moral experience is independent of the forms and categories that apply to metaphysics. Okay, let's take, however, this next step to the corollaries. And you can see already how he handles the question of freedom. The freedom of the will is a corollary of moral duty. That is to say, if we say that morality consists of acting out of a sense of duty, then if morality is to make any sense, there must be the freedom to act out of a sense of duty, which means freedom of the will. So while he is not proving the freedom of the will, it is a corollary of his account of moral experience, of moral phenomenology. You see? If he's right about this matter of duty, then it follows that we have freedom of will.